So the question for today, and something like as believers that we should kind of, always make sure that we stay in the right and do according to what God tells us to do is when you worship the Lord, whether you go to church service or whether you go to like wherever, like the house of the Lord, or if you're like worshiping amongst other believers, and it's the time for worship and time for praise. But the question is, are you worshiping, like, are you truly worshiping the Lord in spirit and in truth? Because here's the thing, we can like, we can say like, oh, I'm worshiping the Lord in spirit and truth. But first of all, do we know what it truly means to worship the Lord in spirit and truth? And one of the components of worshiping the Lord in spirit and in truth is when you are worshiping, your mind, your heart should be drawn to the Lord. You should be focused on the Lord, right? Or are you just in idol worship? Because that's a whole nother thing, right? So as I was spending time with the Lord and he was talking to me about it, I'm like, okay, well, how can you be in idol worship? Like, how do you move from a place of worshiping in spirit and truth to now moving to a place of idol worship, even if you're in the house of God? Because one thing that we fail to realize is sometimes we hear about idol worship and we think back to the Old Testament, like, oh, well, I'm not like worshiping no golden calf like the Israelites did when Moses was on the mountain speaking to the Lord. The Lord told him, "Hey, you gotta go down there and get your people, like, cause they cutting up." Like, so sometimes we think, well, I'm not committing idol worship because I'm not worshiping no graven images, no false gods. I'm not worshiping woods or stones or charms or the stars or whatever. But no, 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 no. You can fall in idol worship, right? When you begin to worship, right? And if you find yourself, if your worship alters based off of who's watching you, if your worship alters based off of who's in the room, you should kind of check that because now you're not even truly worshiping the Lord, right? You then begin to idolize others' opinions because their opinion of you or you're worried about how they will perceive you. It alters how you worship the Lord. So that would be an issue, right? And that's something that I even had to like correct my own self on. The Lord has brought rebuke to me. Like when you worship me in the house, your worship should be the same as it is in that secret place, right? Just as it says in the Bible, when they're praying, God don't really care about the ones who stand on the corner being loud, saying the same repetitive prayers. Like he told you to go into that secret place, right? And in the secret place, as he sees you, he will reward you publicly. But we don't worship the Lord. We don't pray for rewards, right? We do. We were created to worship, right? So thinking that's changed as we were created to worship. That was our purpose. We were created to worship the Lord, right? How the enemy can pervert it and how we live in a nation, we live in a world where they idolize everything, right? Even in the church, we begin to idolize performance, right? So then, once again, here's the question: are you performing or are you truly worshiping in spirit and truth? Because you think you're doing one thing and you're doing a whole nother thing and you think God is pleased with it and then he's not because you're in idol worship. You idolize people's opinions, you idolize your appearance, you idolize so much stuff. Your heart is not even focused on the Lord during worship. Your heart and your mind is not drawn to the Lord. You worried about the neighbor to the left of you. You were about to the neighbor to the right of you and how they're perceiving you. So that's the question today. As you go throughout your week and you do whatever you decide to do, and as you get into a place of worship, right? Um, make sure your worship in public matches your worship in private. I'm not saying it's gonna be the exact same thing, but the way you worship the Lord in spirit and in truth at home when nobody's watching, that's how it should be. Because even though you're in a public place, you're still worshiping. The worship is supposed to be directed to God, not directed to man. So once again, are you worshiping in spirit and in truth, or have you gone astray and got yourself into idol worship?